When working with a vSphere environment, it's not a question of when we're going to need to apply a patch or an update or do an upgrade. It's really just a question of when. And the update manager that's a part of the vCenter server appliance can help us manage that. If we have an ESXi host that needs to be upgraded, for example, from 6.0 to 6.5 or from 6.5 to the next version, we could use Update Manager to identify that the host is out of compliance, meaning it's at a lower version, and we could also use Update Manager to remediate that and to perform the upgrade. And Update Manager isn't the only way to upgrade, for example, an ESXi host from one version to another. We could use the command line interface to go ahead and do that, and we could use auto deploy to do that, and of course we could also use the Update Manager to do that as well. Or if we had third-party software that we were running on our ESXi host for some functionality, we could either install or upgrade that, again using Update Manager. And regarding the VMs that are running on the ESXi hosts, if we needed to modify the hardware level, for example, from version X and set it to version Y for a VM, because we needed some additional functionality that that new hardware version brought to us, we could do that with the Update Manager. Or if we had a new version of VMware Tools, we could identify which VMs don't have the updated version, and then we could go ahead and update the VM tools on those VMs using the Update Manager. The vCenter Server Appliance is an example of an appliance that we could use Update Manager to go ahead and upgrade. So to pull this off, this Update Manager functionality, we have our vCSA, which can go out periodically out to the cloud and identify any patches or updates that we may need. So it builds a list of those. And if we have some older ESXi hosts that we need to update, we'd also need to make sure we have the ISO for the current version or the updated version that we want to upgrade the ESXi host to. Now in our environment, each of our ESXi hosts is already at 6.5. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create one or more baselines. And the baseline is simply going to identify what we're looking for. For example, we want patch number 1 and patch number 2. Now, one of these may be a security patch, one may be a bug fix. But what we're going to do is we're going to identify those patches or those updates as part of a baseline and then associate that baseline with our ESXi hosts. And then we just click a button that says, hey, please go out and check to see who's compliant with this baseline. And we can attach multiple baselines to the ESXi host. We can also create a baseline group that contains multiple baselines. So baseline 1 and baseline 2. If we have multiple baselines and we want to apply them as a group, we can do that as well. And then as we check for compliance regarding these hosts that are associated with the baselines, anybody that's not compliant, we have an option for remediation, which will apply the patches and updates to those hosts which are out of compliance to get them up to speed. So in the same concept where we had host profiles that we used to look for compliance regarding settings, the Update Manager uses baselines, and instead of looking for configurations, which host profiles were doing, the baseline is looking for patches that are applied or installed. Or if we have a baseline that includes looking for specific versions of hardware for our virtual machines, that could help us identify the VMs that are out of compliance, and then we could go ahead and remediate those as well. Here in the vSphere web client, logged on as administrator at nuggetlab.com, let's go ahead and hover here on the home icon and then click on home to go to the home page for the web client. And here under the operations and policy section, we have an icon for Update Manager. So let's go ahead and click on Update Manager. Over here on the left, we'll click on vcsa.nuggetlab.com. And here it has some information about its current activities and events, including downloading host patch definitions and so forth, which it does automatically and periodically. And what we want to do is we want to click on the Manage tab regarding vcsa.nuggetlab.com. And here we have several options regarding the configuration as it relates to Update Manager. So we have network connectivity, download settings. We're using all the defaults here, download schedule, a notification check schedule. And again, these are all using the defaults. We have VM settings, which includes options for snapshots. So if we create some baselines for VMs or virtual appliances, we have the option of taking a snapshot before we remediate or update a VM. And that way, if it goes really, really badly, we can roll it back to that snapshot. If we're doing upgrades, for example, from 5.5 or 6.0 to 6.5, we can click on the ESXi images. And we want to make sure we had a 6.5 image, so if we were doing an upgrade as part of the remediation from a 6.0 to 6.5, that it has the actual software, the bits, if you will, to do that upgrade. On the tab for Patch Repository, It shows the patch names, when they came out, their type, their severity, the category, and the impact regarding applying this patch. And then if we click on host baselines, we have 2 baselines by default. Let me go ahead and widen this column just a little bit. So we have one for critical host patches, which identifies 56 elements, and we have non-critical host patches, which is identifying 144 elements. And if we want to create our own custom host baseline, it's really simple. We click on the plus symbol to create a new baseline. Let's call this our lab baseline. And then it's asking, okay, what type of baseline is this going to be for? Host patches, host extensions, or host upgrades? For our demo, we're going to click on the host patch baseline type. And with that selected and the name in place, let's click on next. Then regarding this new baseline we're creating, we have 2 options, fixed or dynamic. With the fixed option, we're going to identify specific patches, and that's it. Which means in the future, if there's a new patch or a new update that vCenter is now aware of, it's not going to be affecting this fixed baseline looking for specific updates. The other option here is dynamic. And with dynamic, we can specify the categories of what we're looking for, and they would automatically become part of the baseline. For example, with dynamic selected, let's go ahead and click on next. So under the vendor, if we know we don't have any, for example, Cisco virtual switches that we're using, we just want VMware patches, we'd go ahead and select VMware here. For severity, if we were only concerned about critical severity level patches or updates, we click on critical, and that way, if there's a new critical patch that's put out by VMware, it would be caught, if you will, as part of this baseline. And then when we scan to see who's in compliance, we could identify which hosts are not in compliance, and then we could remediate those to update them with the latest patches. And then for the category, we have categories of security, bug fix, enhancement, or other, and I'm going to go ahead and click on any for that. Now over here in the product, because we're only dealing with 6.5, I'm not going to bother looking at updates for 5.5 and 6.0, so we'll click on ESX 6.5.0. I'm also going to leave the release dates wide open. I'm not going to constrain them. And in this dynamic baseline that we're creating, it's currently showing us based on what we have selected, we have 4 patches that match the selected criteria. So with that in place, we'll click on next. So here are the 4 patches that fell within our baseline. And here it's giving us the opportunity to exclude any one of those. So for example, if we did not want one or more of these, we could check them here and they would not become part of this baseline. For our demo, we'll go ahead and take all of them and click on next. And this is like a second chance screen. This is saying these are all the patches, there's 196 of them, that do not match the criteria that you set up. But if you would like to permanently include them, you can select them here and include them. So for the demo, I'm not going to include any above the 4 that we selected previously. So we'll click on next. Here's our summary, and then we'll click on finish. So now we have this new custom baseline called our lab baseline that's going to be looking, at this moment anyway, for 4 specific patches. Now these 4 patches are at this moment in time. Let's imagine it's 4 or 6 months in the future, and somebody's running this lab. Because we created a dynamic baseline, we may have more than just 4 that show up here, which is perfectly fine. So now the question is, how do we associate this baseline with our ESXi host? Or if we had created a VM baseline, how would we associate a VM baseline or a virtual appliance baseline with a VM or a virtual appliance? And the process is virtually identical. What we're going to do is we're going to hover over the home icon, and then let's click on host and clusters from the dropdown. And for our host baseline, we could right click on any of our ESXi hosts, and from the dropdown select update manager and apply a baseline, or we could apply a baseline to the cluster itself. And that would include the 3 ESXi hosts in that cluster regarding that baseline. Or we could go to a virtual machine and go to that virtual machine, and from the drop-down select Update Manager, and then apply a baseline that's appropriate for a virtual machine. That might be checking, for example, the latest and greatest version of VMware tools, or the latest and greatest version of hardware for that VM. So if we were to apply the Update Manager baseline at the cluster level, we'd right-click on Cluster 1. From the drop-down, very bottom here, we'd hover over Update Manager, and from here we'd simply click Attach Baseline. Now that's one way of doing it, or we could go ahead with Cluster 1 selected. We have a tab over here for Update Manager, and if we click on that, we have the similar options right here. We can click on the Attach Baseline. It'll give us a list of our baselines. Here's our lab baseline, so we'll put a check in the checkbox next to that, click on OK, and now it's showing us that our baseline is applied to the cluster. Also down below is showing that compliant we have 0, non-compliant 0, incompatible 0, and unknown 3. And that's because we haven't yet told it to go out and check all of the ESXi hosts in this cluster against this baseline. So if we click on the unknown tab here, here's ESXi 1, 2, and 3 in their unknown state regarding compliance. So if we wanted to scan and check all 3 ESXi hosts in the cluster, all we'd need to do is click right here, scan for updates. And we could also do this off of the drop-down under Update Manager. There's a submenu for scan for updates as well. Now, because we only have patches identified in our baseline, we don't really need to check for upgrades, but we could leave them both. It'll simply scan the cluster and each of the ESXi hosts for anything in our baselines regarding those hosts, so we'll click on OK. We'll give that a moment or two to complete. We could also go down to recent tasks to verify that that is currently in process. And there it shows as completed. That's good. So we'll minimize recent tasks. And then if this screen doesn't refresh, we could go ahead and just do a refresh of the page. And then on the compliant tab, this implies that all 3 ESXi hosts are compliant with the associated baseline that's applied to the cluster. And if we had a host that wasn't compliant, what we could do is we could right-click from the menu, hover over Update Manager, and then we have an option for Remediate right here, which will walk us through the correction or the update regarding those patches for that host. We also have a Remediate button right up here, so we could click on Remediate and then walk through the wizard for the remediation and the application of those patches. So here it gives us the option of choosing which ESXi hosts we want to apply them to. So we'll go ahead and choose all of them, click on Next. And here's where we stop because each of those ESXi hosts already has all 4 of these patches. So we'll go ahead and click on Cancel, but that's the wizard we'd run to go ahead and process the remediation if we were not in compliance. We also have an option for staging patches, which allows us to move the files regarding the patches over to the ESXi hosts so that they're sitting there locally. And that way, when we do remediation, we don't have to both copy and then do the update. We can just do the update. And this wizard is just walking us through regarding which ESXi hosts. And then as we continue through the wizard, we could further select what patches we want to stage on those hosts if they needed the updates. And that way, the files are there and ready to go on the ESXi hosts. So we'll click on Cancel. And if we wanted to apply a baseline regarding a VM, we could right-click on the VM from the drop-down, hover over Update Manager. From the submenu, click on Attach Baseline. And then we have some pre-built baselines, or we could create our own and associate them with that virtual machine. So I'm going to click on Cancel there as well. So my intention for you and I in this nugget was to introduce you to the vSphere Update Manager and the concepts regarding how it works with the baselines, and then scanning objects to verify whether or not they're compliant with that baseline, and if they're not, to do remediation to get them up to speed, up to snuff with either the patch or the version of hardware or the version of tools that you want on that host or VM respectively. And now, my friend, the opportunity is yours in the hands-on lab to practice with the basic fundamentals of Update Manager inside of vSphere. So have some fun with the lab, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope that this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.